Hi, everybody. Your co-host Stu here. Just to let you know, we had some Skype interruptions during the middle of this episode, so you may see a jump cut or two. But we did try to go back and pick up where we left off or where we got interrupted. So if that happens, please bear with us. But it was a unavoidable technical difficulty. And with that, here's today's episode. Hi, everybody. I'm your co-host Stu, and I'm here with the paranormalist Patty Wilson. Patty, how are you tonight?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm also doing very good, although you look a little tired.
I am a little tired.
Mhm.
Yeah. So tonight, though, I wanted to bring a topic that we don't normally talk that much about to the paranormalists. Now, we think about Bigfoot, UFOs, ghost stories, things like that when we think about the paranormal. What we don't think about is the fact that there's another side to all of this. People are fascinated with demons, and I had a conversation many, many years ago with John Zaffis, who's a good friend of mine. And I asked him how he got started. And he said he used to go and go to talks with his aunt and uncle, Ed and Lorraine Warren. He would sit there and listen, and people were just fascinated, riveted to the stories they would tell about the paranormal and the demonic and what have you. And he thought, wow, this is amazing. And he said, I got up one of my very first talks, and I thought, I'm going to do the opposite of what my aunt and uncle did. I'm going to talk about the good side of the paranormal, angels and
Mhm.
things like that. And he said, I started to talk, and I was maybe 10 or 15 minutes into it, and I began to realize people were like losing interest. And he said, so I flipped it around and I said, well, if there's good things like angels, there's also demons. And he said, the minute I said the word demons, people got perky and they were like, demons? And they sat up in their chairs. And he said it kind of always bothered him a little that people were so much more fascinated with the negative side of the paranormal than the positive side. And I have thought about that many times over the years, that conversation. And I wanted to talk tonight about angels. I think the world is filled with enough darkness and sadness and negativity at this point. And
Agreed.
all of us who've lived through it knows what I'm talking about. And we forget that there's good and that there's positivity. And so over the next two storytelling sessions, I wanted to talk a little bit about angels. I think angels are the most amazing and fascinating beings of all the things that God created. They are phenomenal. So I thought we'd first start with a little biographical information on what angels are, how they came into being, and then go into some personal stories. I have several stories I want to share that are more human interest stories. And then I have some stories the next week that I think are just beyond amazing stories. And so we'll work our way through it. So what are angels? Angels are created beings like humans, um, the jinn, and everything else on this planet and in our space. They were created by God. And anybody who doubts that angels exist or are real, you probably haven't read your Bible. The Bible talks about angels over 300 times throughout the book, Old and New Testament. And angels have certain reasons that they come and interact with us humans. Those reasons can be things like ministering spirits, helping us through a tragedy or a problem, or leading us towards God. They can come to give us word of knowledge, to assist us with something. They can also come just to communicate with us. And you see those kind of stories quite a lot in the Bible. The angel came to Mary and talked to her about she was going to become pregnant with Jesus. Joseph was doubting Mary in this whole process, and the angel came and spoke to him. When Christ arose from the dead, there was an angel sitting in the tomb who spoke to the two women who came to anoint his body with, with herbs and oil. And on. There are many, many, many instances in the Bible of angels communicating something that's happening. So I wanted to talk first about the types of angels there are, because they're not really at all like what they're depicted to be on television and in modern literature. So in television and modern literature, they're always these beautiful beings of light, white robes, wings, absolutely gorgeous and boring. It's just the truth. But they're not. They're not actually that at all. First of all, they don't look at all like what they're depicted to look like in modern literature. So the first one we're going to talk about is the seraphim. And these are angels mentioned throughout the Old Testament in particular. And they had 6 wings, 2 of which covered their face, 2 covered their feet, and the 2 wings with which he flew. Exactly how he's described in Isaiah. So this is definitely not at all like what we picture an angel to be. Then there's the cherubim, which we see them as little cherubs. And there's actually a very dark history to what a cherub really is. It's not the cherubim of the Bible, and that would go into a totally different realm. But they're depicted as being in the Garden of Eden, and not these cute little chubby things with little, arrows that shoot you in the heart with it and cause you to fall in love. The best definition of a cherubim that we find in the Bible is that of him standing at the Garden of Eden with a flaming sword, not allowing Adam and Eve to enter once more. He is not described at all like we picture them. And that cherub, as I said, is something very dark and different. So he's kind of mixed up with some old pagan folklore, if you will. What he was to look like originally was to have multiple faces, hands like a human, and wings. So all 4 sides of his head had a different face, and he could see in all 4 directions at once.
That could come in handy.
That definitely could come in handy. Mm-hmm. The only angels that are named specifically there are the archangels, and there's 3 of them that are named specifically in the Bible. Michael, who is the warrior angel. Gabriel is named in the Bible, and Lucifer, who of course becomes the fallen angel of Satan. And you go through this Bible and you find all of those over and over and over again. What you don't find is something called the angel of death. Now, I tell a story, and I will probably tell it before this night is over, of an encounter. And I did a lot of reading about it. So I don't believe, from what I can tell, that there are angels that are specifically tasked just with carrying people to the other side. I think that all angels have that ability, from what I understand. When you're reading in the Bible, there are several places, like whenever the firstborn were taken of the Jews,
right?
And they were all taken in one night. There were angels that came and slew them, it says in the Bible. And it doesn't say one angel, it says angels. And there's other places where you'll see that same terminology, and it doesn't name a specific angel. But I do know that there are angels that usher us up when we die. The best story of that I could tell you is actually one of my first stories in my first book, and it is my family story. And I'm going to share several family stories tonight. The story was about my great-grandmother Rachel, who was very ill and dying of gangrene from sores that had turned septic in her body. And my grandmother and her husband decided to give up their home to go home and take care of Rachel, who was my grandfather's mother, excuse me. So they literally packed up their 7 children, gave up their home, and moved in with Rachel to care for her till death. Now, anybody who has ever done end-of-life care for anyone knows that it's a never-ending task. Rachel was bedbound, she was incontinent, and she had these sores, weeping, terrible fluids. We'll just leave it at that. So my grandmother had a lot on her plate. She had 7 children. She was doing laundry literally every single day in an old wash tub kind of washer. You know what I'm talking about, the old wringer washers, where you hand fed the laundry through. And my grandfather was trying to work on the farm and take care of helping with his mother and helping with picking up the slack with the kids and everything, because his wife, my grandmother Helen, was struggling to keep up with everything. On this particular day, Rachel was very close to the end of her life. Everybody knew it. She was literally, it could be any day. And my grandmother had washed a particularly large amount of laundry that day and still had more to do because Rachel was soiling her sheets at an unprecedented rate. So she would have 7 or 8 sets of sheets by the end of a day, even with the pads underneath her and everything. And my grandmother was the kind of person who would never let anybody suffer, so she wouldn't let her lay there or just make do. So on that day, my grandfather came into the house and he said, you know, do you need any help with anything? And she's like, yes, I need you to take the tray up to your mother. I have so much laundry to get done. She's had several messes this morning. So he grabbed the tray and headed up the stairs. Grandma followed up behind him, carrying an empty clothes basket to go pick up another load of laundry, which was laying out in the hallway at the far end of the hall. And my grandfather went into his mother's room, and my grandmother proceeded to grab the laundry, and she turned to head back down the stairs when she heard my grandfather say, Helen, hurry. Grandma thought, oh my Lord, he found his mother dead. So she dropped the basket at the end of the hall and came running, worried that he just found his mother had passed away. She gets to the doorway, and this is what she always told us. Sitting on a chest of drawers, dresser, in the far corner of the room was an angelic being. And laying on the bed was Rachel. Rachel was sort of propped up. And my great-grandmother said to her son, Chet, she said, oh, Chet, can you hear the music? Isn't it the most beautiful music ever? And he said he didn't hear anything, but he definitely saw the angel. And the angel reached its hand out as though pointing toward her, toward Rachel. And then he began to slowly float upward. And as he floated upward, Rachel passed away. And he went literally through the ceiling. And at that moment, the spell was broken. And my grandfather and my grandmother looked at the bed, and they immediately knew Rachel had died. So there is an angel that comes and gathers people when they pass. There are angels who do that task. I don't know how that works, other than to assume that angels come when they're called. I don't know if it's because that was an angel attached to her. They do talk about guardian angels, and it is believed that there are a host of guardian angels attached to you. But I do know that happens. And I have told the story, I know you're familiar with it, Stu, about being at a place called Hillview Sanitarium, which was an old nursing home. And prior to that, it was a poorhouse. And on that particular night, I was in the chapel. It was 3 o'clock in the morning. There was 2 women sitting off to my right. My friend Jaffa was sitting beside me, and there were 2 young women who were up on the altar, and they had both made a point of telling me very early on in the process that they were atheists. And so they didn't want anything to do with anything religious. And at that point, the altar was set up so that on the far right-hand side, there was a door that went outside. And it was the door through which they would take caskets to the little cemetery in the back and bury them. If there were people that had no family to bury them, they would bury them out back in that little tiny private cemetery. On that night, I was sitting there when I saw what looked like a brown shadow, not a black shadow, coming through the door. And I thought that was just odd. And I watched it And half of it was, it literally was melted into the door. Half of it was through the door, the front half. The second half was still on the other side of the door. And then it stepped in. And when it did, I just was struck with this amazing sense of love and fear, because I recognized immediately that this angel was an angel of death. This angel came to collect somebody. And my first thought was, oh my Lord, somebody here's going to die tonight. And I stood up and I started to cry, and I stepped to the back of the room, and in my head I said, why are you here? And it said, I had crossed a couple people over who were struggling spirits, and he said, I have been waiting a long time for a few of these people tonight, and I've come to collect them. I calmed down a little bit then. I realized that he wasn't coming here to take one of the living, but rather to take one of the people who had lingered behind after dying. And I just felt this amazing sense of love that overwhelmed me. I walked back up and sat down beside my friend Jaffa, and I whispered to Jaffa, take pictures of the altar, please. At that moment, the two ladies at the front who were atheists got up and walked to the far right corner where the door was. Beside the door was a little table with a cross on it, about 3 feet high. And they knelt down and began to pray. The two women on my far right began to sob, although I would come to find out later, none of them saw what I saw, just me. And my friend Jaffa started snapping pictures, and I picked up my phone camera and snapped 2 shots, which I will send to you, and you can post them if you want to,
Okay.
because they're really amazing pictures. And in that moment, he just became this bright flash of light and was gone. And I caught the moment before he disappeared, and that moment of the bright light. And I have to tell you, I've done a little bit of looking around at angelic pictures, and what I caught is very similar to what I have seen in other photographs. I'll send you a couple of those as well, Stu.
Okay. Yep, I can easily put them.
Yeah, it's just amazing. So angels have purposes in our lives, and angels serve us a purpose, and they are the most amazing supernatural being. And the stories of them are literally legion. I wanted to share a story that I thought was really interesting. So I was reading a story about a couple by the name of Sherry and Cody. And they were a young couple. They were walking down along the highway. It was a rainy evening, and they were kind of walking, taking their little stroll, even though it was raining. They had their little rain garb on and was just taking a little walk when there was a car in front of them that lost control and crashed into a car on the other side of the highway. And they saw the entire thing. She slid, must have hydroplaned the woman in the first car, and just slid across the road and smashed into this other vehicle, causing both of the cars to crumple up. Well, immediately they called 911 on their phone, and they went running up to try to help. There was smoke and steam hissing and what have you, and they wanted to try to get them out of the cars because they were afraid they would explode into fire. As they were trying to pull the doors open, get to these people, they realized they couldn't do it. They just couldn't do it. And the cars were beginning to fill with smoke or steam, and they were terrified that they were going to see these people burn alive. The people were inside the cars begging for help, pleading. And one of the women, the woman who had actually hydroplaned, her name was Lisa, she was screaming, please, oh dear God, help me, please. Sherry, who was the lady who witnessed the accident, she was outside of the cars screaming, Lord, send us a miracle. I can't get her out. I can't get her out. I cannot imagine how intense the emotion was. And in that moment, her and her significant other both saw, and so did the drivers in the 2 cars, what they would describe later as a bright white light burst into the cars, and hands reached out of the light and pulled the drivers out of the cars, literally opening the doors and sliding them to safety. And the 2 people, Sherry and her significant other, just stood back and watched. She would later say, as would the rest of the people there, that all they could think was that God had sent angels in answer to the prayers and the desperation that they were so fervently, praying about, because they were scared to death that they were going to watch these 2 people die. And I just thought that was an amazingly beautiful story.
It is. Yeah, I just was trying to think about if I was in a situation like that, that would be very, very emotional.
Yeah, I honestly can't even imagine how intense that was, you know? And to see that bright light burst into the two cars, hands come out of the light, pull open the doors, and slide the bodies of these two injured people to the safety of the pavement. What a miracle. I want to share a story now that is my story. And I don't tell this one very often because it was about my son. My oldest son was 4 years old when he got deathly sick. Like, he just woke up vomiting. I took him to his pediatrician, and I don't know why, but I just knew in my heart of hearts he had appendicitis. So I said that to the pediatrician, and the pediatrician said, yeah, I agree with you, but I'm new to the area and I don't have privileges at any of the hospitals yet. I'm still going through that process. So I need to send you to a surgeon in the area and see what he says. So I met the surgeon at the hospital in Fulton County, and the surgeon was very arrogant. Like, I came in and I said, look, I think he has appendicitis. I'm really scared. The doctor thinks it might be appendicitis. We really need to get this taken care of. And he picked up the phone right in front of me, and he called the pediatrician, and he said, the mother thinks it's appendicitis. Well, that's just too damn bad, because I don't. He's got the flu. Now, there was a terrible flu epidemic that year. I mean, everybody was sick. And I told them that my son had already had the flu like 2 weeks earlier. And this surgeon wasn't even a little bit impressed. So he says, it's the flu, go home. Well, there was a nurse sitting there in the room, and she gave me a little emesis basin, those little basins that they give you to throw up in.
Right.
And she said to me, honey, they don't get the flu twice in 2 weeks. You keep this basin and keep fighting. And it was, to me, the validation I needed. So I went home. I took him to the hospital in the next county over, which is Bedford County. And again, just, it's the flu, go home. And it wasn't the flu. And in my heart of hearts, I don't know if you've ever had that kind of conviction about anything, but I knew it wasn't the flu. So I'm fretting about this, and I keep calling the pediatrician, and he's like, well, if there's any change, let me know. At about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, my son lost consciousness. Like, I just couldn't wake him up. I didn't have a car, so I called my in-laws who live right down the road, and I said, I need to get to the hospital now. Now, you have to understand, living in a rural area, it could take an hour or an hour and a half for an ambulance to get there. We were much faster in the car,
Right.
because it was literally 2 minutes away. We put him in the ambulance, and we went to the third county, Franklin County. There's a hospital in Chambersburg, and in Chambersburg, the hospital was just completely overwhelmed. There were people laying on gurneys in the hallways in the emergency room. That flu epidemic was just devastating people. And they took me into this room with my son, who was at 4. He was not conscious. He had dehydrated from throwing up so many times. They put an IV drip in him, and then they left me there, just left me there. And hours went by. I was on the phone to my mom. I was calling my husband to say, hey, this is where we're at. Can you hurry and get here? And this janitor walked in. I will never forget this man. He was about 5'8". He had long brown hair cut in almost a mullet style. He had a little gold cross in his one ear and a beard, short cropped. And he came in, and he had that janitor's cart, that they pull
Right.
along with them. And he changed a garbage bag, and he said to me, how's he doing? And I said, I don't know. At that time, they hadn't yet told me that it was appendicitis and that his appendix had burst, because it took them too long to figure this out. And he said, oh, he's going to be okay. And I had this weird sense of peace come over me. And I thought at the time, this is ridiculous. He's the janitor, but it was nice to have someone to talk to let some of that fear out too. And he sat there and talked to me for maybe 20, 25 minutes. And then he got up and he left. And that sense of peace left when he left. And of course, a few minutes later, the doctor came in, and he's like, oh, it's an appendix. It is appendix, and his appendix has burst, and we have to have an emergency surgery. Sign this paper. And it was this whirlwind of crazy. By then, my husband was there. My mom was on her way. And they told us that they were going to take us to this room. And when the phone rang, that we should answer it and be the surgeon. And we would not see anybody else that night but the nurse. And the surgeon would tell us what happened in the surgery. And that would be the end of that. So they took us all the way across the hospital to another area. They put us in this room. It had a one-way mirror. And we just sat and waited. It was now 11 o'clock at night. We were exhausted emotionally and physically. We had no idea what was happening to our son. And the same maintenance man came along wheeling one of those floor buffers. And he looked through that one-way glass as though he could see me. He plugged the floor buffer in, and then he walked into the room and he said to my husband, "Go get her a drink. She needs something to drink." And my husband's not that guy that follow orders real easy. And yet he got up and he obediently went out to get something to drink. And he paused at the door and without saying a word, looked back at me. And the maintenance man said, "It's all right. I'll sit with her until you get back." And as soon as my husband left the room, he said, "I know you're scared. You're terrified. And I get it. But you don't need to be. I checked to see who was in the operating room with him. And I know they didn't give you any answers and they aren't telling you anything. And that's terrifying too. But they're really good people. And he's going to be just fine. The doctor's going to come in and he's going to tell you he's going to be in intensive care. But don't be afraid. In the middle of the night, your son will rally and everything will be well." And then my husband came walking in. He got up and the maintenance man left, unplugged that buffer without having ever used it, and then just wheeled it down the hallway. And I kept thinking, why does it make you feel so much better when he's here? He's just the maintenance man. He doesn't know what's going to happen. And yet everything that he said would happen happened. The doctor came in rather than calling us on the phone, told us that our son had made it through the surgery, that he was in intensive care because he was so small and had been so sick all day, and that, it might be a couple of days till he left intensive care. I spent the night there. In the middle of the night, all of a sudden, he just sat up and he said, "Mommy, I gotta pee." And the nurse is like, "No, no, honey, you have to pee in one of those little bedpans." And he started to cry and he said, "No, Mommy, I gotta pee." And she's like, "I don't know about getting him up." And I said, "Well, he's not peeing the other way. Let's just do it. I'll walk behind him, and if he needs carried, I'll pick him up." So we took him to the bathroom. He walked by himself. He peed. He went back and lay down. And he said, "I'm hungry." And the nurse is like, "I don't know about this." Like they had a nurse literally watching all these monitors sitting there with him the whole time. That's how concerned they were. They weren't just watching the monitors at the desk. She was literally physically in the room with us watching all the monitors minute by minute. So after about an hour, she got permission to give him some broth. And by morning, he was in the children's pediatric ward and he was doing great. So I thought, my mother came and she said, "Why don't you go get a shower and get something to eat?" And I thought, sure, I would do that. So I went out in the hallway and I saw this lady cleaning, one of the maintenance people. And I thought, I need to talk to that maintenance man. I need to thank him for his kindness last night because I was really scared. And I was really scared. And I walked up to her and I said, "Hey, I'm looking for this maintenance man who works here." And I described him and I said, "It's not for anything bad. I just want to thank him. He was so kind last night when I was afraid and my little boy was sick." And she's like, "Boy, I'm kind of new. I don't think I've ever met this guy. Go down to the canteen. The lady down there has been there 35 years. If anybody knows this guy, it'll be her." So I go down and I tell the lady at the canteen the same thing. And she's like, "Boy, I just swore I knew everybody that works here, but I don't know this man." So she says, "Go down to she gave me the personnel department directions. And she said, "Ask for this woman. And she's been here for over 45 years. If anybody knows who this guy is, she probably hired him. She'll know." So I'm not one to give up easy. So I walk down there and I say to this lady, "This is what happened the night before. This gentleman was so kind and so gracious, and I just want to thank him." And she says, give me a couple minutes. And she steps out of the room and she comes back in a few minutes later and she says, ma'am, I first of all want you to know I don't doubt your story at all. And the next thing I need to say to you is it's impossible what you just told me for many reasons. First of all, at that point in time, the men were not allowed to have long hair and they weren't allowed to have beards and work in the hospital. They couldn't wear jewelry and work in the hospital. And on that night, the emergency room had asked the maintenance department to not come up and clutter the hallway further with their carts because, as I said, there were people in the hallway laying on gurneys and there wasn't very much walking room between them. So they didn't want the hallway cluttered up further. And the last reason that your story can't be true is because we cut the hospital into sections. And if the man worked in the emergency room section, he would never have been all the way across the hospital in the section where you were taken to wait for the surgery to be over. I don't know who or what you saw, but it wasn't one of our people. And this puzzled me to no end. And I'm sitting at my house about 2 weeks later, it was late in the evening. My son was sleeping on the couch beside me, and as clear as day, out loud, I heard these words. He was an angel. That's why you couldn't find any comfort elsewhere. I sent you an angel. And I don't care if the world believes me or if the world doesn't. He was an angel.
At least you saw them. At least you saw
I
them.
saw him. And you know what? The nicest thing was that my husband saw him, because I would have thought, everybody would have thought I was crazy had no one else seen him. But Gary said the same thing. He was like, yep, he was there. I saw him. I spoke to him. So it was nice to have more than one person, you know, who had that validation for me. But I'm so convinced that these angels come and they do amazing things to save us from things, to comfort us in moments when we need it, to give us messages and words of knowledge. And sometimes I think they come just to see what we will do and how we react. There's a passage in the Bible where Christ admonishes people to always be kind to strangers because you don't know when you're entertaining an angel. And you know, it kind of reminded me of an old story. There's a story about, this is a kind of a folk tale, and I'll end it with this and we'll come back to the angel stories later. But there's a story about a guy by the name of John the blacksmith, and he was just a cantankerous, contrary, nasty man. And he was just hateful to everybody, but he was the only blacksmith in town. And at that time, the blacksmith was a very important person. He not only shoed your horses, but he made your cooking utensils and the hinges for your doors. And he did all kinds of things like that. The nails that you needed, everything came from your blacksmith. Okay. So despite him being cantankerous, people had to give him their business because he was the only one in the area. And word of how nasty this man was made it all the way to heaven. And St. Peter heard the stories from a couple of the angels that this fellow was, you know, was terrible. And one day St. Peter found himself with a couple free minutes and he thought, I'm going to go down there and see this John. Cannot imagine anybody being as bad as they say he was. Well, he went down to earth and he disguised himself as an old poor beggar man, rotten clothes, long beard, all hunched over, weathered face. And he came up to the blacksmith shop, and John came out to the door and he's like, what do you want? And he's like, sir, I've traveled a long way and I am tired and hungry. Is it possible that I might rest in that rocking chair over there for a few moments? And if you have but a few morsels of food, I would be so grateful for him. Well, John was about to tell him to get going when he noticed in the rags a little bit of a glint of something that looked like gold. And he thought, this man has some money hidden. I'm going to see if I can't get it out of him. So he said, come on in, old fella. And he let him sit down in the rocking chair in the corner of the smithy. And he brought him a plate of food and gave him food to eat. And St. Peter's thinking, well, he's not so bad. You know, he gave me rest. He gave me sustenance. And he stood up. And as he stood up, his body transmuted back to that of the angel that he really was, and he disappeared right in front of this man. Well, John didn't know what to make of it, and he just went on about his work. A few days went by, and one day he saw this little imp standing in the doorway. Because, you know, if the word made it to heaven, it also made it the other direction. And this little imp came in and he said, "My Father, who's in hell, would like to see you. Will you come with me?" And he said, "No, I don't think I want to come with you." And he said to the boy, he said, "Why don't you go sit in that chair a while?" And the boy sat in the chair and he waited and nothing happened. He just gave up and went away. So a couple more days go by and another imp shows up. He's a little bigger than that last one. And he tries to convince him that he needs to come. He needs to come meet Satan, Lucifer. John's like, "Nah, I don't want no part of this crap. None." He's like, "Unless you can pay me or give me something, I don't want anything to do with you people, whatever you are." And the third try was the good old devil himself. Big, scary looking figure showed up at the door of the smithy one day, and he said, "You're coming with me, son." And John said, "I don't think so." Now, being that he was a blacksmith, he was a big, brawny fella. And he said, "You'll have to wrestle me down." And they started to wrestle and they tussled, and they came out of the smithy and rolling around. And John saw this big old briar bush, and he worked his way around so that he could knock the devil right into that briar bush. And the devil found himself all trapped up in that briar bush, and he's yelping and yelling. And he's like, "Get me out of here." And he poofed. It's gone. Well, in the fullness of time, John passes away, and he goes walking up to heaven, and he meets St. Peter again. And St. Peter's like, "Oh, John, you turned out not to be a very nice man. You stole money from people. You cheated people. You treated a lot of people badly. And I had some hopes for you that day I went and visited you. But when I look at the book of life, your page of good deeds is almost empty. And your page of misdeeds is almost so full I couldn't get anything else written in it. This isn't where you go. You need to take that walk the other direction." So John goes down and he gets near the gates, and those two imps see him, and they go running, screaming, "Lucifer, Lucifer, that blacksmith's here, the one that stuck you like a pincushion." And Lucifer come to the gates, and he wrapped a lock around the gate, and he locked it up, and he said, "John, you're just a pain in the butt, and I don't want nothing to do with you. I don't even want you." So he told John, he said, "You get going." John's like, "Well, where am I supposed to go? I'm not supposed to go to heaven, and I can't come here. Where am I supposed to be?" And he said, "Well, that ain't my problem now, is it?" And he said, "But I'll tell you what I'm going to do." And he reached over, and there was this big pile of pumpkins by the gate, and he slopped off the top of a pumpkin, and he stuck his hand down in and pulled out the guts, and he grabbed up a coal shovel and stuck some hot coals in it and cut a couple holes in it. And he said, "You take this and you start walking. Maybe you'll find where you belong." Because you see, even good angels or bad angels, either one, they know the difference between a good and a bad person. And they know which ones they want to have truck with and which ones they don't. Now, it's an old folk tale, and it's a very old folk tale, one of the oldest. But even in folklore and in other cultures, angels were a part of them. And so were the demons on the other side. But I want to focus, when we come back to this stories again next week, on some of the most amazing angelic visitations and life-changing events that I have ever heard. So I think with that, I'm going to end for tonight.
All right, I'll look forward to that. If you remember, I did tell you a story at one point of, now I don't know if it was an angel or just what it was, but my son was 7 years old, and he, make a long story short, he basically hit in the face with a golf club, and it split him from the tip of his nose down to the corner of his mouth. I mean, you could see his teeth and his gums. My wife and I were both working. This was at the daycare where he was, and she phones me up frantically, that he's in the emergency room, and I make it there as fast as I can. And so Mrs. Stu sitting on one side of the bed, and I'm on the other side of the bed. And our son, 7-year-old son, 7 or 8, I'm sure Mrs. Stu will come in. No, he was 8. I'm sure she'll come back and tell me. But all I remember, he was very young, and I'm just seeing this boy with this, this perfect face is now no longer perfect. And so I'm sitting on his left-hand side, and I reach out my arm to put on his head because, I mean, they haven't given him any medication or anything, and his face is splayed open. And something brushes past my arm. I feel it brush past my arm, and the hairs on my arm stood up there, but no place else. Now, when I've had other experiences, the hair all over my arms just stands straight up. But this was like somebody just brushed past. So was that an angel? Was that my mother-in-law coming to comfort Zach? Yeah. But I don't know what it was. But at that point, I mean, Zach wasn't in any pain. I can't say I felt any different. It was an odd feeling having something brush past my arm. That it felt like a person, but there wasn't a person there, obviously, that I could see.
The stories, it could have been either one, but I have to tell you, whenever that angelic being came to the hospital room, I felt such a calmness come over me that I couldn't explain it. And I felt stupid when he left because all of a sudden all the anxiety and fear came back. And then again in the waiting room, it was just so different. And again, when I was in that chapel, I felt this sense of absolute love that was so profound. I sat and I just wept. I cried the entire time. So maybe different people have different experiences with it, and I'm going to talk about some of those. There are some amazing stories that I have collected over the years that I want to share.
I'm going to be really looking forward to that, and I hope our viewers and listeners will be looking forward to that. And we would ask if you would click the subscribe button down below, hit the little bell to be notified when we release new content. If you've already a subscriber, we thank you very much. It means the world to us. We have the Facebook group, the Paranormalist Podcast. We also have the Paranormalist Group Share. That's the one I couldn't think of last week. And the Paranormal Asylum. We have the email address, paranormalist@theparanormalistpodcast.com. And I want to make sure that, that's going to be down below in the description, whether you view this on YouTube or through a podcast platform. If you look at the information, that should be there as well. Patty and I discussed before this episode where we would like to give you the opportunity to send us your questions, and we could do perhaps a Q&A podcast if you'd like to know. Well, ask away. I mean, we can always refuse to answer a question if it's too personal or something like that. But I mean, having to do with the paranormal, you name it. I mean, you ask the questions at paranormalist@theparanormalistpodcast.com, and we'll see in the future here about doing a Q&A episode.
I think it would be a lot of fun. I'm curious to see what people want to know, and maybe they want to share an experience and ask what our take is on it, all kinds of things.
So with that, I think I've said everything I had to say, which is usually not much. It's the same thing every time. But so Patty, thank you, and looking forward to the next visit.
So am I, Stu. So am I. So for everybody, good night.